Welcome to a new episode, this time about exposure. And exposure might seem simple, but there's more into it than that. So let's get started. But before we get really started, be sure you sign up for the newsletter so you get offers, news about workshops, and stories about photography, like One Photo, One Story, which is published at the moment, at least, every Sunday. So take a read about that, and be sure to sign up for the channel so you get a notification each time there's a new video up. So let's get started. Light is light no matter what, but how do we get it into the camera in the right amount so we have a well-exposed picture? And a well-exposed picture is something that is not overlit or underexposed too much. The thing is with digital photography that it is better to underexpose a little, at least at the Leica M system here, and the general, but that is because more information is preserved in the dark areas than in the highlight areas. So if you have something that is completely blown out in the highlights, you will have a problem getting it back, whereas you can get it back in the shadow areas. There are more information preserved in that area, so it's better to underexposure maybe half a stop or something like that, so you can lift the picture afterwards in Lightroom, Capture One, or whatever program you use. And especially when you're shooting RAW. I recommend shooting RAW all the time because you can adjust your pictures much more. You have the full information, both regarding colors and what is captured in the file. Whereas if you use JPEG, then you have only a very limited amount of information to work with afterwards. You can also, like I do at the Leica M9 here, set one picture to be shot in RAW, and beside that, at the same capture, it can record a JPEG version in black and white, for example, so you have a comparison, and sometimes that is really good just right out of the camera, but it demands that you hit and nail the exposure right. So how do we do that? The camera have different measurements inside here that can automatically detect how much light is penetrating through the lens onto either the sensor or the curtain that sits behind the lens here. In here at the Leica M9 we have some gray lines here, and they are capturing the light, and the camera reads them from below here to guess, and I say guess, the light. The light medium is not accurate, so you can rely on it. You have to use your eyes, and it depends very much on the image. The camera tries to guess an even exposure on an image, and it demands that that exposure is even where it measures it, and that is what you want. So if you have, like me here sitting on a dark background, it might be able to guess that my face should be lit well, and the other things in the background should be toned a little down. But that depends on the measure you use in your camera. There are different settings available at most cameras, so let's look at them first. One of the methods the camera can use to, and this is the probably mostly used setting, is matrix mode. This mode tries to determine different points of the scenery, the frame, how much light is in there, and then it calculate and try to balance that light between lights and shadows and darks. But many pictures are not aimed for that kind of metering, although many people use it. So instead I use a center spot valued metering. That center weighted metering means that when I sit at the center of the picture, I have the brightest skin and therefore the camera tries to measure this and balance it with what is around. But still, again, when this is very dark at the outside of me, then it might brighten up my skin a little bit too much because it wants to try to balance between the dark and the very light skin area here. But that is the method I prefer for street photography and most photography, because I know that it tries to raise what is around me. So when I look at my metering inside the camera and it says, okay, it lifts this probably a little bit too much, then I simply just stop down 1 or 2 points of exposure at the shutter dial, and then I know it will be more or less accurate, and with some practice you will almost nail it. Another method is to take a measurement of your hand, look at what it says. If it is a little overexposure, just step it down a little bit, keep it on manual, then you will be sure everything that is exposed, like my hand, around the scenery will be exposed right. And it doesn't matter if something goes in complete darkness in the background. What matters is that the subject you focus on, and it can be people or something else, is lit correctly. Then accept something is overlit a bit and something is underexposed a bit. The final metering, which I never use at all, is spot metering, because that demands that you're able to set the spot on your subjects, hold your shutter button halfway down if you have that setting to fasten that aperture, if it's aperture setting you're using, and then press the shutter when you have framed accordingly afterwards, and then do it again for each picture. So that's something I never use. It's simply it is precise when you hit the spot meter, but depends on what you're hitting at. So I will never use that. I use the center spot weighted metering. Then I fasten that for fully manual exposure, because then I know exactly what I get. But first, let's get step by step through how you set your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO, and in what order, or at least I will not say what you should do, but what I suggest to do, because I do it. Then you can follow that example, or you can adapt it to your own way of shooting. Your camera is kind of a small darkroom you carry around. Everything in here is about light. And there's 3 different ways you can adjust light. One of them is, depending on the model here at the Leica M9 here, I have to adjust the ISO by dialing up and down at the back here. So I have to go into the menu. On the newer Leica M11, you will have a small dial up here. You can lift it, turn it around, and set your ISO. Then you have the shutter speed. That's how fast your shutter in here, how fast that shuts for the light. It opens very shortly and closes again. Then you can adapt that going up and down depending on how much light you want to penetrate or how fast you want that shutter to be. Then you have the aperture. That's how wide open your lens will be, how much light you will end in. You can have a very narrow point when you are up to about 16 or above, depending on your lens type, and then you can open it up and open up for more light to penetrate. And these 3 things, they have influence on each other. Each time you touch one of them, you have to adjust with the other one. So let's go through them step by step. To darken an image, you can either do it by one stop, dropping the aperture, or you can increase the shutter speed, or you can lower the ISO. And this way you darken the image, or you pull down the light so the exposure is as it should be. You can go the other way around and lighten up the image if there's too little light in the image to expose it right. And expose it right, I mean what you feel is exposed right, because there's a lot of taste in this. If you like high key images with a lot of light without blowing out everything, and there can be low key mode, dark mode photography where you keep everything very dark and only the absolute important things is lit. But the triangle exposure is influencing on all of this. It's a balance between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And my priority will always be, first of all, I would like to set my aperture, which is how much I open up for the lens, because that influence on the aesthetic of the picture. So that's my first priority. So if I like to have a very shallow depth of field, go back and look on a previous video about that subject and blur everything out behind and in front of my focus point, which will be really narrow when I open my lens up so much. So first of all, I set that either to that setting, or I go up to 5.6 or 8 to have a wider depth of field, so more in focus in the background and foreground on what I focus on. Then I set it up to 5.6 or 8, so that is my first priority. My second priority, which is influenced on the aperture, is my shutter speed. So when I have it wide open, I have to stop down the light from coming in, else it will be overexposure. So I maybe have to go up, depending on the light, always how much light there is, come back to that, to a shutter speed of 1000, 2000 to balance the aperture. So as soon as I shut that down to 5.6, I have to slow down the shutter speed so I get enough light in. So these two influence on each other as one of two legs on the triangle. And then we come to the ISO, and the ISO simply is a standard of light. It is set by the International Organization for Standardization. How difficult can that be, ISO? And that is, the number represents the sensitivity of the light. And that is just a standard set internationally, and we have to deal with that as it is. So as soon as I have set the aperture, how much I open or close down my lens and how fast I set the shutter speed, then I can go to the ISO setting, which is the sensitivity of the light coming in, the sensor, how sensitive that is. And it is straight out comparable to film. And I know some say in the old days when we shoot film, and I'm guilty on that, because a lot of people are going back to shooting on film, which is a really nice feeling to do. But I am a digital photographer, but we refer to the film days. So in a situation in here where there is a cloudy day outside, I have big windows, then I would choose a film like 400 ISO sensitivity. And in modern digital cameras, that doesn't mean a thing. If you have 200, which often is the ideal ISO for the most detailed and noise-free image, in most cameras that is 200 up to 400. So when I set that to that, I have to check if that balances the image. So a image setting of 1.4, a shutter speed at 60 and ISO at 400. Will that give me a correct exposure if I point at the cup here? And this is a little bit against the light. So let's see if that is what does the trick. And it seems to be a little overlit, but I don't know. So what I do is that I take a little test shot. Then I look at my screen. Yes, it is overlit. So I stop down either my shutter speed to decrease the time I open for light getting in, or I keep it at 60 and go back to my ISO, go down to like 200. Now the indicator here still says it is a little overlit, but I have a bright table behind me. I have a white cup with some dark ornaments. And I guess this will be all right. So I check the image. And here I have a better lit image that even could be stopped down a little more. But this is how the three things works together. That's a triangle of light getting in. At many cameras, you can turn on the automatic for the shutter speed. In this case, I cannot do any with the Leica M9 here or Leica M system. I cannot turn the lens into any automatic position because there are no electronic parts in here. It's fully a manual lens. So what I can do is I can set my shutter speed and let the camera at automatic and let the camera guess how much light, how fast it should set the shutter. I never do that. I prefer to do it manually, so in full control. You can also add many cameras. If we go into the menu here, set it at auto ISOs, which I would prefer if it should be the case that I would do anything at automatic, which I don't do. I want to be in control, but if you prefer that, then I would suggest you put your ISO to be automatic, because then you have control on the depth of field with your aperture settings, how much you open the lens and how wide a depth of field you have, and you can control exactly how fast your lens should shut up, so to speak. If you go below 60, you will have difficulties to keep the camera shake-free, and you will not have a sharp image. You will risk it will be a little unsharp because of movement when you press the shutter or you have moving subjects. Instead, I would put that on 125 at least, to ensure you can hold your camera still. If you let the camera decide, you will risk in a dark environment or where the camera measures something should be lit up more, then it will try to slow down how much time it needs to capture the light. It will have a slower shutter speed, and the risk of shaking is big because maybe it goes down to 30 or even 15, and you will not capture your moments sharp and shake-free. Therefore, I recommend use your light metering with some thought and control it manually, because then you will know exactly what you get. Does that demand that you have to adjust the ISO when you're running around? Yes, it will. Will it mean that you have to adjust your shutter speed or your aperture in between when you shift the scene with different light? Yes, it will. But it will be a very good habit to have, and you will not think about it when you're doing it. You simply just know, okay, I have a scenery here. I just dial my shutter speed a little so I get more or less light in here, and you will be able to set it really fast. So use your metering, automatic metering, if it is center spot weighted or it is matrix meter, whatever you prefer, use this as a guideline and not what is an exact exposure, because that is guesswork from the camera. So the exposure of a cup of coffee can be adjusted simply by adjusting one of your triangles ISO, how sensitive the sensor should be, or how sensitive film you're using. That will fix your ISO if you use film, and then you are left with adjusting either the aperture and the shutter speed to balance the light. Doubling or halving your shutter speed produces an increase or decrease one stop of exposure. So common shutter speed stops are, for example, changing from 1/100th of a second to 200th of a second lets in half as much light. So just changing the shutter speed between 1 and 200 will either double or halving that amount of light you are adding to your picture. Next thing is, and that's why I'm talking about this, next thing is the artistic expression. So if you dare to go to full manual, you can control everything. So if you have to shoot up against the light, if the situation is something that is happening and you have the sun or the light coming towards you, then you can open up your shutter speed, for example, to get more light that the camera would let in. It reads a lot of white surfaces or areas, and it tries to put the exposure down if you put it on automatic, and then you will have an underlit image where you actually would like to have a high key image with more light, and you can only do that by taking a test shot or deliberately overexpose it, so to speak, a little bit to lift the light in that area and get a good exposure. You can have a very narrow field of light on a scenery where everything else is in dark, and then you have that little lit area. So you have to set your exposure after what you want to have lit up not overexposed, but lit perfectly, and forget about the rest. Let it tone down and darken it, and you can use that artistically if you control your camera manually after you have checked how the scenery looks. So take your camera up, take a test shot where you guess how much light will be in that area, or you can walk to the area, set the light with your camera on your hand so you know that's well exposed. Go back to your starting point, make a bigger scenery, and see how well the exposure is when you take a test shot, and adjust after that. So if it is still overlit a bit, then you just stop down 1 or 2 exposure steps, or shutting down the aperture a little bit if that's what you prefer, but then it influences on your depth of field. So I prefer to have my aperture fixed and use my shutter dial, and as the last thing, my ISO dial if I need to. So the reason I talk about the ISO dial being less important is simply because modern cameras especially are pretty noise free up to a really high ISO setting. The old Leica M9 here will not go above 800 ISO before it begins to be a little noisy, but modern cameras you can go up to 12, even 20,000 ISO before it begins to look ugly, depending on the camera, the quality of the sensor. So the last thing I worry about is always the ISO, aperture, depth of field, most important. Next, shutter speed to be sure your images are steady. And last thing, ISO, because that's about sensitivity and when the noise begins to kick in to the image. Then there are all the artistic aspects of light. How should it look? Should it be a very dark and a noir-like image where you want it to be with big contrast? And hi Daisy, that's my cat coming by. Nice to see you, Daisy, but can you please step down the table? So things moving, you need a fast shutter speed. For artistic pictures, I set my camera according to the expression I want, and I'm not concerned if something is going in completely darkness. Maybe it can even be an effect on a sunny day where you have that strong light and harsh shadows. That can be the expression of your image, and there you can maybe set it to a opening on the aperture or closing down to 5.6 and 8 or 11 or 16 to get that rich depth of field where you see all the elements in balance with each other, light and shadows, and play with that. If you then do that, you have to be aware that any dust on your lens, especially shooting against the light, will be visible. So you have to have a really clean lens, or you have to remove it afterwards in post-production, which can be really annoying. So I prefer 5.6 and 8 as my maximum aperture. On a quality lens, it will still be sharp at the ends of that. On a cheaper lens, you can have a little distortion on sharp edges when you press your lens to the maximum or minimum. So that's a way to deal with that. In other situations, I prefer a really shallow depth of field, so I open up my lens to 1.4, and as we just talked about, then I have to push my shutter speed to 2,000 or 4,000, depending on how much light there is, to get a balanced metering. And again, that will influence on the ISO setting I will use at the end, but this will be what I carry about at the last thing. So only when I haven't sufficient light, I will begin to pull the ISO up to get more light in, so I can fulfill my dreams of 1.4 aperture and 4,000 in exposure, for example. So there the ISO comes in at the last thing I worry about. So there are a lot of artistic decisions to make. If you accept that something is overlit, that you accept something is overexposed or underexposed, so you get a more dramatic feeling. So I show different pictures during this session, and here you can see a picture with a lady sitting on a chair and a young girl coming by, and that is shot up against the light. If I let the camera determine automatically the exposure of this, I would have an underlit image because there's so much bright light and things around them. So I have to push up the exposure instead, so I can see what happens and accept something is overexposed, but that's part of the expression of that image. If we look at another image with a bird, it is deliberately overexposed in the highlights are blown out, and at the same time, because of the very strong light and the contrast, we have everything still in silhouette. So the bird and the parasol and everything else, except a few things in the background, are completely dark, so have this really graphic expression. If I had let the camera decide what to do here, it would clearly have stopped down the really overlit background, and then it had killed all the interest and disrupted or destroyed that graphic image. So that's part of the artistic expression. If we take the girl sitting here at the River Seine in Paris, where we have some strong backlight and side light, she would not be properly exposed if I had let the camera decide this, no matter what metering I have chosen, because there are so big, white and overexposed areas or highlighted areas that the camera would have tried to stop them down to make an even, and here we just talk mathematics, evenly lit image, which will kill the interest in the image. So deliberately this is raised or overexposed, if you could say that, by 2 or 3 stops to lift the light in the picture so we get it exposed well, and accept it is a high key image that is more white than normal. So another example, also at the same photo shoot with a workshop I had there, here we have a woman or girl sitting smoking an e-cigarette, I guess, and we have some dark areas in the background, some dark boats, but I expose after the skin tones and forget about the rest. They can tone down in darkness and increase the interest and the focus on the girl, and let everything else be a little noir, a little black, and also because I shoot a little bit against the light, that enhances the light in the smoke from the e-cigarette. We can take another example, like there, I guess the camera would have guessed the light, maybe it would have toned it just a little bit too much down. A man sitting on a outdoor cafe, but here we have both gray tones, darks and lights, but they are more or less evenly spread around the image, so I guess the camera would have done that without me interfering very well, but still I prefer to have full control because it is a habit to have it in full control and set it all manual. Train your eye, get used to the one camera you use, and I say the one camera because shifting cameras will get you out of the habit from knowing your camera and how exactly that camera measures the light. Also, stay with the same exposure metering if it is a matrix all over the image metering, or it is a center weighted metering. Stay true to that because you will learn to know exactly what the camera does in different situations, and then you adjust after that. So that was a little bit about exposure and getting it right, and the rest is up to your artistic expression. But you have to control your camera, and you have to know exactly how your camera works in order to control that and make a good exposure, whatever that means, because that's at the end, there's no precise solution. It is what you see and what you like. Thank you for watching, and be sure to sign up for one of my workshops around Europe, because we will dig into this and much more and have some inspiring talks and photo walks where we explore cities around Europe, where we explore the streets, practice seeing the moment and controlling our cameras.